All right, chapter 18 covers the scientific revolution and more than that. Really what happens in this chapter is opening of the mind of the world. Before this point, we see, historically speaking, people accepting their roles as they have for generations and hundreds of years before that. This is just my station in life and this is the way it's supposed to be. But suddenly there is this questioning, this, hey, I wonder what else we could learn. And this feeling of, I kind of like the scientific revolution in that you see men and women that are taking pieces of information and building on it. Because you see one person discovering something and the next guy going, you know, if that worked, I wonder if this will work. And they basically work through the process that we now call the scientific thought process, this inductive and deductive reasoning. They work through all of this process and they come up with new ideas. And again, they're building off of. Where before that, we're not really seeing that happening. Whatever innovation happens, it's not to say it's just like one person going, oh, I got it now. But it is in some ways very isolated. So now we see this idea of we're going to grow not just in ideas and not just in science, but just in overall thought and how we think of things. But so let's kind of dive in. Again, I'm just doing a quick overview of things. You need to read the chapter so that you can best be prepared. Look for those bolded terms and then try and maybe just look through this with me, and hopefully that will help you out a little bit. It starts out kind of explaining what I just did as far as why this is important and why we're even curious about it, because before this point, science wasn't important. It was almost witchcraft to some degree. And if you did not believe the way things have always been believed, then maybe you're blasphemous and maybe you don't have faith in God the way we expect you to, those sort of things. And so these are very prohibitive for many of the philosophers, thinkers, scientists, doctors, etc. before this point. They break free of this. In some ways it's gradual, and in some ways it's like boom, it just happens. In my seated classes, I talk a lot about these great leap forward. And as we are finishing this particular course, it's going to happen time and time again. The discovery of fire, the invention of stone tools. These are great leaps forward for mankind. From where I sit, chapter 18 really does highlight some of those major leaps forward, that jumping over the idea that I can't be Christian if I question the status quo. And so with the scientific revolution, they're going to now question everything, but they do it, many of them do it very respectfully, and that they're trying to, they take the approach of, we're trying to prove God through science, and so we see that several times. The scientific revolution really does start with Copernicus. Nicholas Copernicus, he studied astronomy, medicine, church law. He's a very religious man from Krakow, Poland. And he focused on Ptolemy, who was a great Egyptian thinker, who we look back on his material now and go, oh, that's preposterous. But before that point, it was generally accepted that this is the way things are. And so Copernicus says, I don't think this is quite right. What this is, that I keep mentioning, is the focus that the earth is the center of the universe. How arrogant were we at this point? So Copernicus begins to say, I think maybe the sun is the center of the universe. And this is problematic for the Catholic Church. Not just the Catholic Church, even the Protestant Church. They said it conflicted with biblical scriptures. What happens then is somebody else next in line is Kepler. Johann Kepler comes in behind him, uses the research of Tycho Brahe, and he says, you know what, Copernicus was right. And he is able to prove Copernicus's hypothesis. Next up in that line is Galileo, which you guys are all familiar with. He used what we call the experimental method. He didn't want to speculate. He didn't want to say, well, from my my perspective, this is the way things are. Instead, he wanted to prove, he wanted to find ways, mathematically, science, whatever it took to prove his point. He used his law of inertia, arguing that motion, not rest, was the natural state of objects. And that doesn't just apply to you and I here on Earth, it applies to the universe at large. He said that objects were continually in motion and not stopped until they're met with an external force. These are concepts that really do lead us into the next great mind, and that is Isaac Newton. He accepted Copernicus's hypothesis that the Earth was not the center of the universe, but he wanted to understand these other planets. He wanted to understand how they were controlled, what forces controlled them. So he came up with the idea that objects are attracted to each other, and this force of attraction is proportional to the objects of matter. Now, I'm not going to get deep into the science, the math of it, because I'm not math or science, but it's important to realize that these guys are asking questions that were not asked before. You weren't supposed to ask these questions, and there certainly wasn't the acceptance that you might find an answer to these things. Next up is Francis Bacon. He used the theory of inductive reasoning, also known as empiricism, and demanded that evidence be gathered through observation as well as experimentation. It can't just be, well, I'm looking at it and I think it's this way, and so there we go. Well, I've proved my point. He wants experimentation. He wants cold, hard facts backed up with experiment upon experiment upon experiment. He didn't want speculation. Next up is René Descartes, who used Cartesian dualism and basically talked about matter and mind. He said that there is a physical world and a spiritual world. And that's important scientifically speaking, but also religiously speaking, that these two worlds can coexist and it's okay. We're not non-Christian because we are studying these things. He also used deductive reasoning, which is the process of moving general principles to specific truths. And this is something those of you that are science-minded probably understand a little bit better than the average Joe. You also have Paracelsus, you have Vesalius, Robert Boyle, all these guys who are using other people's work to make major advances in medicine and chemistry. As all of these people are working on different projects, some of them colliding, some of them having nothing to do with one another in theory, we are seeing the growth of the scientific community. And it grows quite substantial. Again, they're questioning everything, and they are doing it really for the first time in a very, very long time, and it's accepted. And we start to see some of these Western countries, the religious people, accepting this. They become maybe pro-science, I think your book calls it. Beyond the scientific revolution, the other part of this great leap forward is certainly the questioning and the thinking, and this is where we get that terminology enlightenment. This goes hand in hand with the scientific revolution, but more importantly, these are two different aspects of it. Those of you that are not science-minded, this will be a little bit maybe more of what you're thinking of. You have incredible thinkers such as Pierre Bayle, you have Spinoza, you have John Locke in his essay on human understanding. He's the one that proposes tabula rasa. He's the guy that says we're all born with a blank slate. And with that, we're going to have the world change us through our experiences. He takes that a step further, though. It's not just that we experience life and that's how we learn. He says we process that information, which I think is very important to consider. And this is really a driving force in a lot of education even today. In portions of Europe, particularly we talk about France, but it's not exclusive to France. You have men particularly known as philosophes. You have Montesquieu, you have Voltaire. These are men who are writing about tolerance and about government and how we are governed and how it impacts the society at large. The truth is, if you really read this material, some of them are very privileged, and so they are supportive of absolute power coming from the king and queen. But I think that if you really read deeply, a lot of them are saying we support it, but it's sort of a fearful thing. They're not quite ready to make that change. And then you have some really strong minds, such as Adam Smith, who pushes that boundary. He's specifically known for his ideas on business and the economy. He wrote Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. You've probably heard of the Wealth of Nations before. And basically he says government doesn't need to really be involved in business, that supply and demand are going to influence how people are buying things, and it's going to ultimately benefit the government. And so he does step out a little bit against the government, where some of these other guys are still kind of working through that. Is this society the way things are supposed to be? You see a lot of this conversation landing in something called the salons, and this isn't the salon like we talk about today. We're talking about a portion of a home where women particularly would gather and talk. They would bring in some intellectual mind, and they would discuss and debate and learn more about philosophy and other things going on. Part of this enlightenment, probably one of the greatest minds, certainly from your book's perspective, is Rousseau. Very influential in the Enlightenment. He was dedicated to a concept called individualism. He wanted to liberate the individual from all binding agents, including, in some regards, religion and politics, etc. He argued that, surprisingly, as individualistic as he was not quite as pro-woman as you might expect. He certainly saw the women as an important part of society, but he still felt like gender rules dictated that women stay at home, even those of privilege, or more importantly, those of privilege. Beyond that, you see this enlightened absolutism growing. And what I mean by that is it's not just the people, it's not just these philosophers and these random thinkers. It spreads into the courts of Europe, and I'm specifically referring to the royal courts. Your book talks about Frederick the Great, Catherine the Great, Maria Theresa. These are important forerunners of the enlightened absolutism, who bring in these enlightened ideas and apply it to their country and their political nature at large. Specifically, I do want to mention Maria Theresa's son, Joseph, who in Austria abolished serfdom. And this is a huge leap forward, particularly for Austria and Europe at large. Basically said that peasants could pay their debts in cash rather than servitude, because before this point, dating back to biblical days, if you owed a debt you couldn't pay, you were put into debtor's prison. And Joseph essentially bought into the idea of, how am I going to pay a debt if I'm in prison? And so he said that enough of this serfdom, because essentially these people, whether they are physically in prison or they're imprisoned by their servitude as serfs, they're never going to get up in the world. And so he abolished that as a whole. The Jews were greatly impacted by this as well. Often we as Americans perceive Jewish persecution as a Hitler thing. This is World War II, but that's so wrong. What happened to the Jews was a long time coming for the Second World War. Thousands of years these people have been persecuted, but during this time period, these couple hundred years before the World War that we're speaking of, even then the Jews are living under discriminatory laws. Often they're pushed into ghettos, which is familiar to us. They're excluded from business and professional activities. But the Jews do have an enlightened philosopher by the name of Moses Mendelssohn, who gained some notoriety by pushing for freedom and civil rights for these European Jews, often called Haslaka, which is a term you'd want to know for your quiz. Your book then takes a turn into what this actually looked like as far as the layout of the land, the new enclosure system of kind of dedicating this portion of land to our cattle, and this is my land sort of thing, where before they just freely roamed. You also see the impact of the economy and consumerism on the world at large and how that's going to impact those colonized nations in the New World. We also see the growth in this ideology of white superiority. We see that impacting not just Europe, but also the Americas, Asia, Africa. There is this idea of superiority that Europeans, particularly European whites, are better. And that is something that will certainly run through the next several chapters at large. Hope this helps you a little bit. Again, I'm just doing a quick overview, so you do need to make sure and read the book. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be in touch soon.